Thank you so much for joining us for the 8th in this series of live webinars offered by the Virginia chapter of the Nature Conservancy. This time we're featuring a presentation on solar siting in Virginia with senior conservation scientist Judy Dunscomb. I'm Margaret Van Cleef, Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Nature Conservancy's Volgenaw Virginia Coast Reserve Program, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Please allow me to touch on a couple of logistical points before we get started, and then we'll get rolling with the presentation. As you probably recall, this webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to revisit any information you may have missed or that you would like to hear again. We'll include a link to the recording in our follow-up email so you can share the presentation after the fact with any friends who may be interested. Please know that while we can't see or hear you, we would love to hear from you. We invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A function, which our team will vet and share with Judy and Solar Siting Project Coordinator Nina Copeland to answer live following the presentation. And to find this function, just move your mouse around and look to the bottom of your screen. Several options should appear, including one that says Q&A with a little dialogue icon. Please click that Q&A icon and submit your question using that method. We ask that you refrain from submitting your questions via the chat function and instead do use Q&A, as the chat can get busy sometimes and we want to be sure to collect all of your thoughts. We'll get to as many questions as possible in the period allotted, and we will include Judy and Nina's responses in our follow-up email to any questions that may remain. So with that, I'll hand it over to our State Director, Locke Ogans, who will introduce herself and our speakers. Locke.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you join us today and grateful for your participation in this seminar and all the ones that you've done before. And we're also really grateful for your support. Without all of you all who are on this call, we could not accomplish our work. And so on behalf of our whole team, I really want to thank you for that. And I also want to tell you before we begin today's presentation that we hope you'll save the date for our next webinar on April the 29th. And the focus of that presentation will be Talking Climate with Lena Lewis. And Lena will help us all find the right language to describe the type of work we need to do to combat climate change. And I think it'll be a great presentation. But today, we're really excited to share with you our work to plan strategically for large-scale solar in Virginia. As many of you, I'm sure, know, our state has made a significant commitment to developing renewable energy. And of course, at TNC, we love that. It's good for the planet. But we also know that where renewables are sited is super important. Poor siting can negatively impact many other things that we care about, like irreplaceable habitat or cultural resources that are important, or the communities where people live. And so to address these challenges, TNC is mapping solar development sites across the Commonwealth, trying to find the best places to put them. And one of the things we're really interested in that you'll hear more about today is finding ways to reuse already degraded land rather than prime land that's good for other purposes. So today you're going to hear from Judy Dunscomb about the model that she and her team are developing and have developed to guide smart solar development. And it's a real pleasure to introduce everyone to Judy. She's our senior conservation scientist here in Virginia, and she holds a master's in natural resource ecology from Duke University, even though it pains me to say that as a Wahoo. But she has 28 years of conservation experience with our team, and she is a woman of many talents. For instance, she is a credentialed type 2 prescribed burn boss, so she can help with all our prescribed burns. She recently served on the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality Solar Energy Permit by Rule Regulatory Advisory Panel. That sounds like a good government agency. And she chaired the panel's environmental subcommittee. Judy's also the project manager and principal investigator on a Science for Nature and People partnership project that we have recently wrapped up here in Virginia with our colleagues, looking at wealth and environmental sustainability and regional economic development across the central Appalachian coal fields. So with that, it's my great pleasure to hand the program over to Judy, and I'm sure that you will learn a lot more about her solar siting work. Judy, over to you.
Locke, thank you so much. And I think it really says a lot about, the hope that we can have for the world, that a Wahoo can give such a warm introduction to a Blue Devil. So thanks so much for that. Well, welcome all today. I really appreciate your being here. As Margaret mentioned, it's a beautiful day, at least in a lot of the places around Virginia. And we're incredibly happy that you have chosen to spend an hour of your day with us. And we look forward to sharing a conversation with you around how do we achieve our solar energy goals without impacting critical lands. Before I fully launch into this presentation, I want to take a moment for some very important acknowledgements. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Nina Copeland. Nina is our solar siting project coordinator. She also is a recent UVA grad and has been working with us to do the actual GIS models that you're going to see today. And all the maps are of Nina's creation. Also, Chris Bruce is our GIS manager, who has been invaluable in coaching Nina through some of the processes and helping us to find important data sets. And then the work that you're hearing about is partially funded by the Virginia Environmental Endowment. So our thanks to them as well. So here's the plan for today. We're going to take a little bit of time talking about our project objectives. Why did we do this? They're going to share our solar model, the very exciting solar model. And we're going to have a little bit of a pivot from that to talk about what does a good site for renewable energy look like, one example of a good site. And then we're going to finish up with our conclusions and hopefully have plenty of time for your questions, which is my favorite part of any talk that I give. So with no further ado, I'm going to launch into the conversation about why did we do this? So in our history, the Nature Conservancy has typically focused on areas of high conservation value. So this is a map from the 90s, actually, that shows biological hotspots around the US. And you can see that there are definitely places that stand out. And one of them is here in Virginia, Western Virginia. We have some bump in Southeast Virginia. But Virginia is a very important place for biological diversity within North America. But these days, we're not just focused on where the rare things are now. We're really conscious of the need to consider how things will adapt to climate change. So where will they go? Where are strongholds where they can find the nooks and crannies that they need to adapt to a changing climate? And where are the corridors that they will use to transition from where they are in the landscape now to places that'll be hospitable to them in the landscape of the future? So we have not abandoned our place-based work at all, but we understand the landscape a little differently than we did 10, 20 years ago. And we're really thinking about, like we said, resilience and permeability. What does it allow? What does it take to allow things to flow? And this map, which you've probably seen before because we like it and we use it a lot, you can really see the kind of continental significance of the flow that goes through Virginia. So if you're not able to see, I'm trying to get my mouse to show up here, you can see the Chesapeake Bay, and then this is the rest of Virginia. So we have that really strong current that goes along the Appalachian Mountain Ridgeline. But we also have currents that feed into that through the coastal plain and the Piedmont and up from the states to our west. So that need for adaptation and flow and that large scale habitat connectivity is really important. And we know that renewable energy is a very important thing for us to have because we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But we also know that renewable energy has a really large footprint. And in fact, studies that Nature Conservancy colleagues of mine have done are showing that development of energy, not just renewables, but all forms of energy, is one of the largest drivers of land use change throughout the United States. And that's only going to increase as we try to find homes for all the onshore wind, all of the onshore of the land-based solar, and even for offshore wind off our coast. So what you're seeing on this map is a bit of a story about where renewable energy is now. And I made this map to show North Carolina and Maryland so you could kind of get an idea of what's in store for Virginia. And this isn't even an updated map. So there are many more dots on the Virginia landscape, and there are also many more dots in North Carolina and Maryland than there were when this map was originally made. So you can see we're going to have a lot of solar sited. But what we're also finding is that communities where solar is being sited are not often welcoming, or often not welcoming that renewable energy development. And there's a lot of fear and concern about the land use conversion that's taking place. So we wanted to get into this conversation where we know that there's a lot of concern. We know there's a lot of interest in renewable energy development and also not converting important lands. And we wanted to lead in this conversation by saying, look, we need development and conservation, that we can't view this as an either or. So one way to illustrate this is through this kind of a grid here. So if we think about land and water conservation and the good things about land and water conservation here in the upper right part of the screen, we do conservation so we can protect rare species. We do conservation so that we can have clean water. We do conservation so we can have healthy forests that provide habitat for wildlife and also provide secure carbon and keep that carbon out of the atmosphere, and provide really, all of this can provide really fun places for people to play. But we also need renewable energy development because, as I said before, our climate is changing in ways that could be catastrophic. And we're going to lose some really important places if we don't address the amount of CO2 that's going into our atmosphere. And there are also communities that are very welcoming of an opportunity to have solar energy development and develop a new path forward for those localities. So if we focus too much on land and water conservation and not enough on renewable energy, we run some risks. So this is in the lower right-hand side of the screen right now. We run the risk of missing some opportunities to revitalize or reuse degraded lands. And we definitely run the risk of missing our opportunity to get a grip on our carbon emissions and reduce the concentrations that are in our atmosphere. But at the same time, if we focus only on the renewable development side of it and not on conservation, we could risk losing some really important forested areas, some really important natural areas, and poorly done solar energy development can cause water quality degradation and increase of impervious surfaces in our some of our important waterways. So the secret here is that we are not trying to choose land and water conservation versus renewable energy development. We are trying to avoid the worst outcomes of focusing too much on both and accomplish that good outcomes that can come from focusing on the best sides of both. So that's why we did this. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what exactly it is that we did. So we knew that there is a lot of concern, but we asked ourselves the question, how much land is available to site solar energy in Virginia? What are we talking about here? What does it even look like? So we developed a very simple model looking at some things that are important for placing renewable energy. So how steep the land is matters. How far away it is from a transmission line matters. It matters that the land use is relatively open. And it also, the size of the patch that's available matters. So in Virginia, a lot of our, and throughout the East Coast, a lot of the facilities that we're seeing are like 50 to 30 megawatts. And just have this figure in your head that 1 megawatt of solar energy takes about 10 acres of land. So we look for places that could sustain something like 1 to 3 megawatt facilities. And those are 10 to 30 acre sites. And then we have we sort of a break. We don't have a lot in the middle. And then we have things that are like 10 megawatts or bigger. So we looked at places that were 100 acres or bigger. So the patch size matters, how much area. A couple of things we didn't talk about or didn't include in our model are transmission capacity. So is there space in that power line to carry the power from the solar facility? And we didn't do this because it's really, it's doable. It's just time, it's only time and money that it takes to do that. But we wanted a product that we could turn around pretty quickly and get this conversation going. And if there's interest, we can tackle this more complex modeling process next. We also didn't consider land price. Land price is definitely a driver of how much it costs to do a project and therefore how interested developers are in a site. But it's not that easy to find a single number that's too much or too little. We'll talk about land price a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so here's the big reveal. The big answer to the question of how much potentially solar suitable land is there in Virginia. And when you're looking at this map, before I show you the big number, I'm going to tell you a couple things that are going on here. So when you look in the western part of the state, I think it's pretty clear where the transmission lines are. The land is pretty flat east of the Blue Ridge, and the access to transmission is the real driver. Now, when you get into the mountains, with the exception of the Shenandoah Valley, when you get in the mountains and you move west, the transmission lines are less of the limiting factor, and then terrain really takes over as a driver. So how steep is the land? So you may not be seeing a whole ton of blue like in Southwest Virginia. There's a lot of it there. It's just in smaller pieces, smaller patches, but there is a lot of land. But it's also obvious that there is a lot of land in the eastern part of the state. So before, again, I'm teasing you with this big number, but again, we also wanted to make sure that we had a pretty good model. So we looked at some information where companies go to apply for permission to input their power into the grid. And we looked at those applications, which are a good indicator of where folks are. And we mapped those locations on our model to see how much overlap there was between where developers are looking to build and what our model predicted as good sites. And what we found is that 92% of those facilities fall within our model. So this is actually an excellent outcome, even though it's a simple model, it's a very valid one. So here's the big number. So how much land is available for solar in Virginia on land? About 8.7 million acres. That's a lot of area. We have a lot of space. So that's a good outcome. That's a relief. We know we have a lot of land. But now the trick is, how does that interact with places that are important for conservation? So to get to that question, the Nature Conservancy has a lot of sophisticated mapping tools that show us where our priorities are. But we know that we're not the only ones. We don't want to build a model that only we care about. We want to build a model that reflects the concerns of a broad base of stakeholders. So for that, we went with this Conserve Virginia layer. Conserve Virginia is a relatively new thing for the Commonwealth, really has been created over the last couple of years. The great thing about its purpose is to identify the highest value and highest priority conservation lands for land protection. And a great thing about it is that it has a lot of different values represented in it. So in addition to conservation, it also has ag and forestry and floodplains and cultural and historic preservation. So a lot of things that are important to a lot of people are reflected in this model. And it's consistent throughout the state. So even though it's not perfect, there is no perfect layer to use for this, we went ahead and used this one. So when we overlay those two things, the potentially solar suitable lands with the conservation priority lands, we get this outcome. So where you see orange, that's where these two layers intersect, which is a suggestion that those places are probably not good sites for solar energy development. And how much is that area? That's about 2.2 million acres, or about 25% of the modeled area. Okay, so let's take a breather and let's review these numbers. So we have potentially solar suitable land is about 8.7 million acres. We have important for conservation lands about 2.2 million acres. And when the difference between that, you get about 6.5 million acres that we think are potentially suitable for land conservation. Now, how much area do we need? That's a great question. Nobody knows. The number keeps evolving. But what we can say is that the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which is a big driver of all this renewable energy development, found about 16,000 megawatts to be in the public interest, 16,000 megawatts of renewable energy to be in the public interest, which makes it more likely that it'll be built and permitted, or permitted and built, I guess. So remember, 1 megawatt equals 10 acres. So 16,000 megawatts equates to about 160,000 acres, 161,000 acres. Now, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we know our model is wrong because we didn't account for stuff like transmission. When you get into the nitty gritty, some of these sites aren't going to be suitable anyway. And we know we're not reflecting all of the important conservation lands, even though we used, a good layer. So let's just say we're really wrong and we chop that 6.5 million acre land, let's chop that in half. And then let's say that, you know what? Let's say that the number of how much land we need is really bigger. Let's just double it, just to be conservative. Let's just say we need that much more land. What we find is that we still have 10 times as much land area as we need to site land-based renewables, solar energy, that 10 times as much as we need. And that's the big takeaway here. This is a solvable problem. So that was a great outcome. We were really relieved to find that answer. We think we have room to move. So one of the things that people are really excited about with renewable energy development and how to avoid impacts to important natural resource areas is to look for opportunities for solar development on degraded lands. So we wanted to be able to run some similar numbers and share those numbers with you and other stakeholders about what the opportunity looks like. But unfortunately, we can't do that. We can't share those numbers with you today. And that's because the data on where these degraded lands are is not really in shape to be analyzed this way. So for example, we know we have points. We can put a dot on a map, which we have, about where these things are, but we don't know how big they are. We don't know what space what is the parcel that they're on, and what space does that look like on the landscape. And so we can't do any analysis with just, a dot on the ground. So we need an effort. And it's becoming, I think, increasingly clear to us that this is someplace we want to really help advance moving forward. We want a really good data set that helps us understand what the opportunity for solar development on degraded lands is. And again, even though the data sets we have now are not great, this is a very solvable problem. We live in a world where satellites circling the Earth can tell you the soil moisture on the surface updated every 3 days, right? We can definitely find where these degraded lands are that are opportunities for solar development, whether they're brownfields, whether they're former mine lands, whether they're abandoned golf courses, landfills, et cetera. We can do this. It's just a matter of a few $100,000 and some time and stakeholder engagement. I do want to point out, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't say, in Southwest Virginia, where you see all these yellow dots, this is the coal fields region of Virginia. And the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy has a great project that they have done, really identifying which former coal mine lands are good for solar development. So they have that layer for that part of the state, and it's a great model for what we can hope for the statewide. The other question we really wanted to answer is, who is affected by solar energy development, and what's the nature of that impact? So what we really wanted to do was to take those degraded lands and ask questions about who lives around them. Are there typically underrepresented communities that live around those brownfields? What are they concerned about? How might solar energy benefit them? How might it not benefit them? So that was another analysis that we wanted to do, and we couldn't do it, again, because we didn't have the good data on the degraded lands. But we didn't want to lose the environmental justice story completely. So we did take a look at land value. And that's something where I'm not a demographer, but the Nature Conservancy is a land trust. We understand about land price and what it takes to actually do a land deal. So one of the narratives that is out there in the public is a concern that areas like Northern Virginia that have a lot of tech companies, that have a lot of interest and demand for solar, are outsourcing their solar footprint to communities that have lower land prices, more rural communities. And there's a narrative out there that suggests that this isn't benefiting those local communities, and that they're bearing a burden disproportionately. So we don't know if that's true, but we do know that there is a very broad gradient of land value in Virginia. And we do know that rural communities have identities that are very important to them. And so the thing we want to highlight here is that as we move forward with renewable energy development, equity has to be part of the conversation. And how do we ensure that in these communities, the benefits of solar are shared, and the burdens are also shared, and that neither the benefit nor the burden is disproportionately placed on one part of the state or one community within the state. So with that, I'm going to pivot to the idea, the question about what does a good site look like? And for that, we are going to go to Southwest Virginia and the Southwest Virginia coal fields. Locke mentioned that I had a project looking at sustainable economic development in the Appalachian coal fields region. And so this is a place where we've thought a lot about this issue and how do you create programs or opportunities that really allow communities to benefit from projects that are happening. One thing, so the place that we're going to be talking about is our Cumberland Forest Preserve. It's a 250,000 acre preserve that is spread out between Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And so you can see the orange area in Virginia and then the red area that's in Kentucky and Tennessee. So a little more than half of the project is in Virginia. And you can see also all this conservation land around it. And what we're trying to do here is that map that we showed in the beginning, this is part of the way that super highway that things will use to move in response to climate change. So we're trying to really connect, make a very strong connected corridor here. However, when we did this deal, we had some things that were kind of new for us that we put in as goals. So we have our conservation piece of this story very solidly in hand, but because this was such a big project, it was also necessary for us to find some novel forms of funding. And so we have impact investors who have agreed to a certain rate of return, or the expectation of a certain rate of return, in providing financing that helped us do this deal. And then we also have very explicit goals for community benefit. So we have all three parts of this puzzle that we're trying to accomplish on this property. And here's where the story comes back to solar. So of the uses that we have on this property, one of the ones that we thought could be compatible with our conservation goals, provide community benefit, and help us provide return for our investors, was to lease some of the lands for solar. So the first thing we did was we made a map that it's almost like a downscale version of the big Virginia map that I showed you. We looked within our land ownership in Virginia. We looked at all the sites, but I'm showing you Virginia today. We looked, where are the sites that we think are really well suited for solar energy development? And where are the sites where we think, no way, solar is not a compatible use with our conservation goals? And then what's in the middle? So you can see green areas, so particularly in the area around Pound, Virginia, in the left-hand, and Wise in the left-hand part of the map. There's a lot of area there that we think is really suitable for solar energy development. And then we have a lot of area sort of in the southeastern part of the property that's yellow that we are curious about. Maybe there's some opportunities here if we can find the right developer. And then we have a lot of the rest of the area in this sort of salmon pink, which is, no, we really have other things we're trying to do here, like manage forests for carbon and habitat for elk, and those aren't compatible with our solar goals. So I show this with you to kind of, help you think how this might happen on the ground in a locality, in a place where we really start to think through specifically, what are our goals and what do we need to achieve here, and where can we make room for solar, and where do we know it's just really not the right place? So in conclusion, I can't wait to get to your questions. Our big conclusion is Virginia can meet its renewable energy goals without converting important natural lands. The challenge that we have is that there's no one decider. There's no lever to push, no one button to pull or push that lets us make this just happen. A landowner has a decision about how they're going to use their land. Localities make decisions about whether permits will be permitted or not. So we need to really all work together to decide that we want renewable energy development and we want conservation, and from our own place, our own vantage points in our own communities, work together to make that happen. So with that, I would be delighted to take any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you, Judy. This is just absolutely fascinating work that you've got going on. And we do have some questions coming in. And folks, we encourage you to continue to submit your questions as Judy and Nina are discussing the answers to the ones we already have. And just a reminder that when you do submit the questions, please use the Q&A function and not the chat. Our team is accustomed to vetting the questions as they come in through the Q&A, and that's also how we're able to capture them to answer any lingering ones at the end. So let's see here, Judy, let's start with this right now. What about rooftop solar?
Ooh, that's a great question. Okay, so conspicuously absent from the last 20 minutes or whatever was any discussion of rooftop solar. So rooftop solar is got to be part of the solution here. It's got to be one of the ways that we keep renewables off of important natural areas. Let's see, there's already a really good model for what our rooftop potential is at a state level that was done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And what that model shows is that about 30% of electricity sales, the way they measured it, so, but just say roughly about 30% of the amount of electricity that was used in Virginia in 2018 could be generated through rooftops. And so that means that there's a significant chunk that we could get from rooftops. Now, the problem is that rooftop solar is a lot more expensive because the installations themselves are a lot smaller and you really lose economy of scale. So, so we really wanted to focus in on the big drivers of land use and have that conversation, but and it starts to get complicated when you add in all these other parts. But rooftop is definitely part of the solution, and we're looking forward to getting it to be a bigger part of the conversation. And I say rooftop, let me just add one more thing, which is that the NREL study looked at rooftop, but our colleagues in Long Island recently completed a study where they looked within their 2-county region at what's available on rooftops, what's available if you put like structures over parking lots, and then what's available as land-based solar, the way we mapped it here. And they found that they could, they could meet like 5 times the amount of electricity need that they thought they needed for that area through those 3 sources. So we're looking forward to trying to get some interest in answering that question in Virginia as well.
Great, thank you. All right, Judy, let's see. Can we site in parking lots? This would help keep the lots and cars cooler. Photovoltaic cells would be over the parking spots themselves only. Traffic lanes would not be covered, so would stay lit by the sun.
And that is also a great question. And it starts to make me a little bit suspicious. I wonder if I know the person who asked that question, but I'm not going to call anybody out. So
it was Kathy.
It was Kathy. Okay, it's not Kathy. But this is exactly the question that my dad, I told him I was going to give this presentation. My dad asked me that very same question. So, yeah, so no, it's a great idea. And again, it's a matter of funding, and where do we, because it is more costly to build those facilities. How do we find the revenue streams that makes that an option for a locality, whether it's a municipality who's paying for that infrastructure, or a developer who's paying for that infrastructure? How do we figure out how to pay for it? But it has clear benefits. Absolutely.
All right, great. Okay, let's see here. Why were the areas between 30 and 100 acres excluded from the model?
Oh, that's another great question. Nina, would you like to go ahead and answer that?
Yes, I can speak on that. So when we first discussed, or when we first went through creating this model, we discussed with experts from Dominion about what area classes or how big these solar sites were. And we learned that most solar facilities generate between about 3 or 10 acres of megawatts of energy, which roughly translates to about 30 acres and 100 acres. However, after we checked through a lot of the data, we learned that a lot more solar facilities actually generate about 5 megawatts of energy, And then that translates to about 50 acres. So after learning this, we actually learned that we needed to update our model to include acres up to 50, areas up to 50 acres. And so that's actually pretty fortunate for us, because that means that we'll be adding more area to our model. And then therefore, that means that there is actually more potentially solar suitable land in Virginia.
Great, Nina. Thank you. Got your first question out of the way, Nina. You're all right. That's great. It's an exciting moment when you've got an internship and you're presenting with the senior conservation scientist, right?
No, it is very. I'm very happy to be here and be able to answer these questions.
Well done. Definitely. Well, this is a good one. Cindy writes, I am new to solar. I understand the basic upsides of solar. Will you educate me about some of the burden you noted regarding solar?
Yeah. Yeah. So part of the problem is that I'm not personally sure what the burdens are, but here's kind of the scope of the problem. And Nina and I were having a conversation with a professor at Virginia Tech about this very question this morning. There are communities that are typically not involved, that have been excluded from land use decisions around the Commonwealth. And so, and those communities, so we need to make sure that all voices are heard when a locality is making a decision about what it wants its future to be like. So that's one thing. So a burden could be your voice isn't heard, your voice doesn't matter. Another burden that could happen is that in producing the solar, there are some unintended consequences. And the nature of unintended consequences, it takes a while to figure out what those are. But in the coalfields region, one of the concerns that has been expressed by the localities is that creating utility scale solar, which is what we're talking about, where you have the installation and then you just plug it into the grid, it occupies that land, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the local community because the electrons don't stay, they go. And so in that sense, it's not all that dissimilar to coal mining, where you're removing a commodity from the region and taking it out of the region and creating wealth outside of the region. So, so the trick is to figure out, and there are plenty of well-intentioned solar developers out there, to figure out how do we make, through community benefit agreements that are part of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, or through other agreements that developers make, how do we ensure that if this land is occupied by that solar installation, that the locality is really getting value from that installation being present, and and benefit to that local community. So hopefully that answers your question, and feel free to send a follow-up if you'd like to hear more.
Thanks, Judy. All righty, how about, let's see. Does installing solar panels on already degraded land prevent or negate the restoration of degraded land through increasing organic matter, soil biology, and things like cover crops?
Oh, neat. That's a neat question. Yeah, so it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to at all. So there are a couple of different things I want to speak to you about this. First of all, the Virginia Natural Heritage Program has a solar smart pollinator program where, and our colleagues in North Carolina have also been involved in advocating similar actions, where in between the rows of solar panels, instead of just having gravel or some kind of non-native grass, that there are plantings that include native plants that are more representative of our of the kind of plants you would find on a little Virginia native prairie, which we actually do have or have had. So, and when you have those inner plantings, then you can actually get some deep roots. We think that there might be some carbon storage benefit. We know that those deep roots are down in the soil. They're loosening up that soil that may have been compacted before. They're decomposing and storing carbon in the soil. So there are opportunities to improve soil health and build solar installations. But the other nuance of this question that I want to address is that on these degraded lands, anything that is done to those lands costs money. And so oftentimes, whether it's an abandoned mine land or a brownfield in an urban setting, oftentimes some kind of redevelopment is needed in order to create an opportunity to improve the status of that land. Because there's not enough like government dollars to go fix all of these places. So when you can have a solar developer who's doing a really good job with the soil health and interplanting for pollinators and hedgerows around the edges, that is a complete win-win, because that's restoration that probably would not have happened without having some economic incentive to do it.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's see here. Oh, are you going to make this model publicly available? Can I get a copy of the map?
Nina, this is a map question.
Yes. So we actually used a proprietary data set when we were creating this model. So we're unable to share the actual model or maps of the model with the public, but we did work on creating maps that show like an aggregated or county level aggregate of the amount of solar suitable area per each county. And we also within that have a map that includes the amount of land that conflicts with Conserve Virginia. And so we'll be able to share that with you all in the follow-up email.
Great, and maybe Nina, it just occurs to me that we are working on that project with your colleague at ERI to try to figure out if we can use a different data set, and the model might not be quite as good, but it'll still be pretty good, and we could share something that looks a little more like what we have on the screen right now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really great opportunity, especially since we are learning that it matches up pretty well with what we have.
Cool. All right, let's see. Okay, a new concept just raised was the thought that there should be a bond put in place for end-of-life reclamation, similar to what is required of coal mines. Any thoughts on how that may impact potential developers, particularly on smaller sites?
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts on that. One of them is that there are decommissioning requirements now. So, so that already exists. And it's a very good idea to have that for decommissioning. But the big question in my mind, and I've heard different things from industry on this, but I think that there's some agreement around this view that I'm going to share, is that once the super expensive part of solar development, as I understand it, is the part where you actually tie into the power line. You have to build like a substation and do all that other stuff. It's very costly. And once you do that, you have a piece of land that is highest and best use is probably, again, solar development. So in 30 or 40 years, when these panels would normally be removed when you'd be at the end of the life of the project, it's hard to imagine that we wouldn't need the electricity from that site. And it's hard to imagine that the next use after solar is not going to be more solar, hopefully more efficient, more powerful, maybe more compact, but it's hard to imagine that just going away. So I just put that out there to think about, that once these things are out there, there's a really good chance that, who knows what's going to happen 50 years from now. I certainly don't even think I'll be around to see it, but it's so hard to predict. But I think we should not plan that we're only going to need these things for 50 years and then they're all going to go away.
Okay. All right, let's see. The panelist, or you're the panelist, the attendee here writes, I may have missed it, but what were the variables TNC used in determining suitability of solar on the Highlands project property? And he says, yes, suitable, maybe suitable, or inappropriate.
Oh yeah, so I didn't actually share that. So we used the same kind of variables to get at what was good for solar, the slope and the land cover. But then we had a couple of things. We know what our conservation objectives are on the site. So anything that was in forest, in what we call sort of high quality forest, that's off the table because we want to protect that. We have areas we're working with the Department of Wildlife Resources on elk and elk habitat. So those came off the table because elk are large and they don't coexist in a friendly way with solar panels. And then we also removed any sort of sensitive streamside habitats from that layer. So basically the same kind of variables that we showed on your initial slide, and then we pulled out a couple of other important conservation areas. So what remains are largely lands that were previously mined.
Thinking about elk trying to maneuver around a solar panel.
Yeah,
Gave me a
good day for the
cartoon.
solar panel. Definitely not a good day for the solar panel.
No, that's true. Yes, I know it's serious, but the cartoon image I got is pretty funny. So we'll just keep it as a cartoon. All right, Judy. There seems to be a disconnect between the areas that are best suited for solar from your modeling and your focus on the mined area in the coal fields. Can you elucidate?
Yeah. So, one thing we learned, so Nina spent weeks trying to look at this one brownfields layer we had and like figure out what actual tax parcel it belonged to and do that. And then we got through the end of that. And then unfortunately, all of those areas were too small. We had to take them all out. And then, so that wasn't, that wasn't a learning experience for you, right, Nina? But then we went further and we went to the Department of Mines, Minerals and Energy. We asked them for more of their mined lands layers. And what we learned is that there are mine sites all the way throughout the Commonwealth. Some of them are very old. Some of them are probably reforested and and maybe providing important habitat. So they're not necessarily all good for renewable energy development, but we have those degraded, we have those previously mined lands and other types of mining besides coal throughout Virginia. So, so the question is, how big are they and what shape are they in now, and are they suitable? So that's one of the things we really want to answer with this sort of maybe like a phase 3 project that we want to do. Another thing is that there are other types of sites that could be suitable, like capped landfills. And we don't have any data on where those are statewide. So, so to pull together a layer like that, and we know that we have landfills in the eastern part of the state, capped landfills in the eastern part of the state, that could potentially provide some good opportunities. So, really excited at the prospect of trying to garner some resources and some interest and appetite in doing a much better job on representing the full scope of what's available for degraded lands.
All right. Let's see, have you made this information available to the Virginia Natural Heritage Program for their plan review section?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So first of all, we can't touch what the Virginia Heritage Program does for their plan review. The data that they have is so much better than anything that we showed in this model. So we have the goal of this is not at all to try to preempt their environmental review, which, like I said, when they look at a specific site, they have a lot better information about that specific site than we used for this broad statewide model. But we totally have shared this information with them. And in fact, they were among the first group of partners that we went to when we made our map. And we all talked about the Conserve Virginia layer, which is also constructed by the Division of Natural Heritage. And that, some of the shortcomings of that layer and some of its strengths. And yeah, so yes, I think we can thoroughly say yes. And the other thing I would just sort of want to add on to that is the map that you're seeing on the screen right now shouldn't be interpreted as everything in blue is great for solar and everything in orange isn't. We really this was meant to answer the question, how hard is this problem to solve? And how much potentially suitable land is out there, and how does that roughly, and to estimate the interaction of that with important natural lands. So like I said, we know that this model is wrong, but it's useful. It tells us we have a lot of room to move. but we don't yet have a map that you could look at and say, oh, great, blue, good. I can just put my solar facility here and I don't even have to worry about it. That is not where we're at yet. Maybe someday.
Great. Thank you for that clarification too. Oh, does large-scale development of solar fields affect bird migration, especially if this increases along the Virginia corridor?
Yeah, that I do. I'm not 100% sure the answer of that. I could imagine. Okay, so in the Southwest, in the United States, there are solar arrays that are of a different type, and they have more reflection, and they become very, very hot. And so in that region of the country, there have been some bad interactions between those solar facilities and migratory birds. But that's not the kind of installation that we have here. So I know that problem is not our problem. Definitely the clearing of forest is particularly in places where we know that birds migrate through. And really in the fall of the year, particularly in the eastern part of the state, like the Eastern Shore, but also mainland Virginia, there's a lot of area that is really important to those fall migrating warblers. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to think through when we are converting forests to any land use, really. But when we're converting forest for renewable energy, we're definitely taking away important sheltering and feeding habitat for those migratory birds. So it's not unique to solar, it's just that land use change. I think that is the big threat to migratory birds in Virginia.
All righty, let's see. Have you considered dock-mounted panels? With 250 feet of unshaded south-sided dock, we have potential for solar without shading creek much more than dock-mounted panels.
Oh, no, I haven't. I've never heard of dock-mounted panels, but I love it. And my guess is that would be one of the variations of a rooftop or of a parking lot, or one of those other places where we integrate solar development into our built environment instead of putting it out into places that are into open land. So I love that idea. Let's see if we can work it in.
Okay, great. Awesome. I like it too. Are solar companies rated on their efficiency, cost, and availability for both individuals and communities?
No, they are not. That is a very interesting question. So what I wonder about that is, who would do that and what would that information be used for? And I think that one of the things that we're interested in is how do we get people that buy solar power to be curious about where it came from and what was on the land before the solar installations were built. So that scorecard, that what I'm calling a scorecard, that you talk about, could be the kind of tool that a power purchaser might use to make sure that they're getting solar energy that has the kind of attributes that they want. That's a neat idea.
All right, thanks. And I think that we'll go ahead and have this next one be our final question for the program, but there are questions flooding in. So get ready to have some after presentation homework, Judy and Nina, and we look forward to seeing those questions and your answers. But let's wrap up with this one. Oh, it's kind of a three-parter. What is the answer and what brings you hope? How do we make sure that we build solar outside of natural areas?
I can speak on the hope part, but I'm not sure about the other two. But I remember back when I graduated for about a year, but in my last year of college, I always heard this 2030 figure of everything needs to happen by 2030, or, we just have to be better, I guess, as a country by 2030 in order to reverse climate change and things like that. And so being able to work on a project where I'm seeing like how things are actually happening and how people are working so that we have more renewables. I mean, I've always heard, that coal is going to run out eventually, but that we're working on renewable energy and also conserving lands in Virginia, and this is my home state. So I also love hearing about how we're trying to do that too. And then again, you think about, like, I don't know, not in anytime in the near future, but like having kids one day, and what kind of world that they're going to be living in soon, or in the next few decades. So it's really great to be able to work on this project and to just see how things are going. And it's so lovely being able to work with Judy and everybody else at TNC. So yeah, that makes me hopeful.
Nina, thanks a lot for that. That's really kind. Yeah, I guess give me hope. And how do we get this to happen? And I have my little inspirational slide. I think the part, what gives me hope is, Nina, and the fact that all of you took time out of your busy schedules to be part of this conversation today, which I wish was more of a conversation, and one day we'll be able to do that again. But this, as I said, this is a solvable problem. Remember, we have 10 times more area estimated than we think we could possibly need for just the kind of renewable energy development that needs raw land. And the challenge is that there's not one decider, not one button to push, not one lever to pull. So if you can show up for this conversation, then I think that means that you're curious. And if you're curious, then you can be curious where out in the world, and you can say, well, what would it look like if we had solar energy development in our community? Where could it go, and what could I do to make a space for that in the place where I live? And what could I do to talk to my neighbors and my friends and my family to get them to think like, yeah, we're going to lose some land. We might lose, some places might look different, but it's worth it, right? If we could get these renewables, and if it's in the right places, and we're not eliminating things that are really irreplaceable. So I know there's a lot of curiosity among Nature Conservancy supporters, and I know there's a lot of dedication, and so that really does give me a lot of hope.
I like this hope. Thank you all so much for these thought-provoking questions. We are quickly approaching the time limit, so Judy and Nina will respond to any lingering questions in the follow-up email, which you will all receive quite soon. Y'all please take care, and thank you so much for joining us. And now back to Locke to send us on our way.
Thank you. Thanks, Margaret, for doing such a great job of moderating this. And Judy and Nina, thank you so much. And I hope everyone on this call can tell what a privilege it is for me to get to work with people like Judy and Nina and the rest of our team at the Nature Conservancy. And I think it's just been a great window. You're seeing a project that's been developed but still has a long way to go. It's already bringing benefits, but there are going to be more. And we couldn't do it unless we had the ability to work with a lot of different stakeholders. We work with private companies and solar developers. We're working with the state of Virginia. We're working with other NGOs, and that kind of partnership is what makes me have hope too. And I just think, Judy and Nina, thanks for giving us a window into how this work actually develops over time, and how you're making a difference, and how you're trying to balance two really important needs: the need for renewable energy with the need of creation and people to have places to live and thrive as well. And they're totally interrelated. So thank you so much. And then just a final thank you to everybody on this call. As I said before, we absolutely could not do this work without you. And I hope this has given you some good information and some good thought. And it's a pretty good lead in for our April 29th webinar that's going to be talking about climate. So, you'll learn some more from Lena Lewis, another great member of our team, about how to think about these issues and how to talk with your friends and neighbors and people who can influence where we're going to make the planet a better place for everybody, people and nature. So with that, thank you for your support. Thanks again, Judy and Nina and Margaret. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Stay safe and be well. And it's great to see you all today. Bye-bye.